Another PS5 jailbreak news update. So we have a lot of updates to get into over the past since my last official jailbreak news update. Obviously, I have been covering a lot of the individual videos, but I'm gonna compile it all here along with a lot of the latest updates. So let's go ahead and dive straight into it. Okay, so let's start off with the biggest piece which is the release of 5.50k stuff on the PS5. So if you are on firmware 5.50, you can now attempt to load this new test build of K on your console, and that might allow you to, of course, run your PS for fake packages. Finally, not only that, but there's also the ETA Hen to 0.0 pre-release build, which also I believe works with 5.50. So you can load that first and then load the K-Stuff payload second, so that you can basically have, ETA Hen mostly fully up and running. Of course, if you're on a 5.10 firmware actually has been fully integrated with ETA Hen. A pre-release build, that specific build is accessible on a few hosts. Like you've got Zeko's which you can access from S7in1.site. You can access it there and load that and version. Then there's also a version 1 and a few other different versions that also the new ETA Hen build that's integrated the 5.10K so you can just load and it will load ETA Hen with K-Stuff integrated on 5.10. If you're on it's only just been released, so you'll have to load it separately for now. And also, the other 5.x firmwares are being currently worked on. So 5.0 and 5.0 today are in the works. So we can expect to see those follow shortly. Now we can see here that Stretch has also mentioned that they are working on 7.61 K-Stuff, and if that happens, it will truly be a seismic shift in the status quo for PS5. Jailbreaking, bringing consoles up to 7.61 to the same level of support that we've had for a long time, like 3.02 for .51. There's also been some major improvements to getting game dumps working, so we've seen from a speed-00 7 on Twitter a few more games that have been successfully dumped and turned into working backups, like the Callisto Protocol, and a couple of other ones that I believe require 6.x firmwares in order to dump them. So the self-decryptor was untested on 6.x and was not working on 7.x initially, however. That has now changed. So it was actually working on 6.x. It just wasn't tested. But now we've got people testing it on 6.x and it appears to be working. Not only that, but Stretch has actually managed to fix it for 7.x firmware, which means we can now successfully decrypt our games all the way up to 7.61. I was testing this on my 7.61 and yesterday system. I was able to successfully decrypt to games on my 7.61 console. The Last of Us Part 1 and A God of War Ragnarok, which both seem to decrypt successfully, although when turning them into a backup and trying to run them on my 4.03 just results in a black screen. So obviously there are still some issues getting those games working. But the fact that we can dump games all the way up to 7.61 means the pool of PS5 games that could potentially be turned into working backups is much larger than before. Initially, it was only games up to the release of 5.0, which basically was games up until about, April 2022, which was the cutoff point for games that we could try and turn into working backups. Now with 7.61 being able to decrypt the pool of games that we can essentially turn into working backups goes all the way up to about October or November of 2023, versus before, which was about April 2022. So a big jump there in the number of games that can be potentially dumped and turned into working game backups. Obviously, there will still be a lot of work individually on the games to try and fix certain games to allow them to run as game backups through items flow, and that work obviously continues. But yet, definitely exciting that a lot more games will potentially be turned into working backups. Not only that, the downgrade script from Idle Sauce has also been updated. This is the script that allows you to basically patch the executables for games that are dumped on higher firmware to change their target SDK version to an older SDK version and allow them to launch on older firmware. So this has now been updated so that you can actually specify the PS5 target SDK to patch the executables too. So that has now been changed as well, along with some other improvements included in there. So that is another update there. So moving on from the game backup situation, another thing I thought I would mention is that there's a new project that's popped up on GitHub from the developer of the Apollo Save tool, which is Apollo PS5. So it looks like development has begun on a PS5 version of the Apollo Save tool. There's no code on this repo at the moment, but this should at least give us a sign that development has begun on this PS5 version, so we'll have to wait and see. Ends up initially just being a port of the PS4 version on PS5, which would still be very useful, but would only target PS for save files on the PS5, but again, that would still be very useful compared to just being able to use the save monitor, which is the only option we have right now. Managing PS for saves on the PS5. So an Apollo Save Tool port would be very handy. Although what would be even more amazing is if it could also do something with PS5 saves, like being able to mount PS5 and export the decrypted save data and import decrypted save data from PS5 save files, since we're not really able to do anything with saves at the moment. So yeah, no code yet in the repo, but it looks like development on a PS5 version has begun. There's also been some new plugins released for ETA, one of them being a game debug message error patch, which basically allows you to patch out those universal data registration error messages when running a PS5 game backup. These messages normally pop up when you first launch the game, but there are some games where it will spam a bunch of these error messages every so often, like a Plague's Tale Requiem, which is obviously highly distracting when you're trying to play the game. So this ETA hen plugin will patch those error messages out. They'll no longer appear on screen when you're launching your game backup, so that you can play your game in peace. Definitely a handy feature that's been added there. We also got the release of a new payload called that has also been turned into an ETA hen. So this plugin allows you to connect to your PS5 through a remote desktop running in your web browser, which can give you access to a file manager to access the console remotely. You can also do things like back up your save files. There's also going to be a package installer included in a future version. Not only that, but you can schedule tasks to run on your PS5. You can run scripts on your PS5, and you can get your console information. And you can also do one of my favorite features of this, being able to remotely launch applications from the browser on your computer as well. So you can just select a game or an app that you want to run, and it will launch it on the console. And you can go straight from one application into another. So I can go straight from one game, then launch another game, and it will just without having to return to the main menu or close the original game. It all happens in the background. So yeah, really awesome feature that's been added here. There's been a few more updates to this as well. Also got the release of an installer for the plugins from More1. So this is a package file that you just install onto the PS5, and then when you run it will extract the plugins to the data folder on the hard drive, to the ETA hen plugins folder, so that you don't have to copy the plugins manually with FTP. So that's now been added. It will also install the icons, so that you can use Jailbreak from the browser on the PS5 itself. So it all displays properly on the PS5. Obviously, Jailbreak is mainly intended to be used on a remote device, like your computer. You can remotely install package files and access the file system, but it can be handy to have access to it on the console itself through a web browser shortcut. So that is all included here with this new and installer as well. So I'll leave that all linked down in the video description. And since I recorded this, the latest version of this installer has also now included the cheats for ETA hen to 0.0b. So it will also install the latest cheat files along with everything else. Now there's also been some updates to the jar loader from Hammer 8 with the Blu-ray drive version of the exploit. So it's now been updated to version for 0.1.0. And this now includes the Jailbreak payload in the actual menus inside the full version of the ISO. So when you write the ISO file to a Blu-ray disc, put that in your PS5, inside the menu, you will now have the Jailbreak payload. So if you want to access like root FTP through the Blu-ray drive exploit, then what you can do is basically access the menu once you have the Blu-ray disc loaded, and then go down and select the UMTX first option to run the kernel exploit. Once that's successful, you can press X to return to the menu, then run the Jailbreak payload, which should now work. Previously, you had to inject the Jailbreak payload separately, otherwise it would freeze the menu. So now that's no longer a problem with this new version. You can now select the Jailbreak payload, which will allow it to escape the sandbox. And then once that's done, you can return again with X back to the menu, and then run the FTP server to get root FTP access. Again, the username for FTP is PS5JB, and then the port number 5, and you'll be connect and get root access. Another improvement with this is that you should now have access to some directories that were previously not loaded, as previously the user, for example, folder would just be blank in the previous versions. But with the version for 0.1.0, once you load everything correctly, you should be able to get access to those directories that were previously not showing any files. So now the user directory is fully accessible with this version of FTP. So that is now being improved, and finally, there's also an ELF loader that is work in progress using the Blu-ray drive version of the exploit. So this has been added, but it's currently not working in its current state, but it has been worked on. So obviously the ELF loader would be very useful. You can run the ELF loader using the Lua version of the exploit, as I've shown in my Lua exploit guide. So you can basically use the Lua version of the exploit to load the ELF loader. And that would certainly be useful with the Blu-ray drive. It's obviously not necessary because you could potentially, I guess, port a lot of the ELF loader payloads over as jar files and load them that way instead with the jar loader. But obviously for convenience, it would just be handy if it could load the existing ELF loader. That way it would already be compatible with existing payloads that are already out there, instead of having to rework a lot of payloads to be loaded jar files with the Blu-ray drive exploit. So that is something that we will hopefully see. It is definitely being worked on, but there do seem to be some issues with getting it working at the moment. And speaking of the Lua version of the exploit, we also got a new backup released from Master S9, which now includes the Hamada Shai created save file. So his backups should include all of the remote Lua save files to load the Lua version of the exploit included in that backup, so you can just restore that backup and then file, no matter which Artemis engine game that you have, and you'll be able to load it up. And it should load the save file with the remote Lua loader, so that you can then send the Lua payloads to execute on your console. So that is now available too. So those are all of the main updates that have been happening in the PS5, with hopefully a lot more to come very soon. So hope you guys enjoyed this video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and once again,